Chapter 12. The Exile.
"What are you doing here?" demanded the woman, the surprise in her voice pitching to outrage. "I begged you not to leave, and you choose now to show up? Sneaking into the living library in the dead of night? And who is this?" She was gaining steam now, turning on Kendra. "Hello," Kendra said brightly, cheeks colored. Caleb stood paralyzed, looking at his sister with an expression that she understood all too well. "I'm Kendra Aberth. Pleased to make your acquaintance." She plowed on doggedly before that stony glare. "Your brother brought me here because I was in some trouble, a bit lost. Well, actually, it got quite dangerous for some of it out there, and he decided that he would help me get back to my traveling companions. And he's been helping Adrian, too, my friend over there. Caleb's been very diligent and kind to me, and it is an honor to meet his kin." She bowed her head low, forcibly biting down on her wagging tongue. The woman stared, bemused, before she began to laugh. It was tired, historied, but still the sound of it leached some of the tension out of the siblings. Caleb unclenched his jaw, breathing in deep, and she rubbed her forehead warily. "You speak very nicely for a trespasser, Kendra Aberth. My name is Rowan, and I am glad to hear that Caleb has become such a fine gentleman. When he lived here still, he could be rather sharp-tongued at times. Perhaps it might be said that he was even occasionally inconsiderate." Caleb snorted. "You'd be amazed what a few years in the wild will do for your manners." "Still picking up strays, I see." Rowan's brow was furrowed, the words landing with weight. "Well, I did try to avoid it this time around," he said wryly. "But there's some habits that are terribly hard to break yourself of." Something in her face softened, and she smiled. "Yes, I suppose it is good to know that it's still you, after all." Rowan stepped in closer with a look of poorly disguised worry. "Your eyes. You've been down there a long time." Her hand shook for a moment as if she wanted to reach out, but thought better of it. Then she cleared her throat. "Well, be that as it may, obviously you can't be here." "On that we quite agree, and I do intend for us to be departing shortly. We're just here for some guidance." "You know I can't just ignore this. This is exactly what got you in trouble the last time." Caleb worked his jaw, but when he spoke, his words were solemn and clear. "Rowan, my hands are already dirty. I've made my choices. I've paid for them, and I intend to go on paying for them. So, at this point, does it really matter if I have a small relapse?" "Please," he said, voice suddenly throbbing with emotion. "Please, if I can't be honored among my own people, at least let me find it in some small way on my own." Rowan looked at them consideringly, an old pain in her eyes. Then she sighed. "Well, if we're going to speed you on your way, then you'll certainly need my help." She knelt beside Kendra with a reserved smile, keeping the length of the table between her and her brother. "What progress have you made? What guidance do you need exactly?" "We're looking for anything that can get us south. There's been a storm front sweeping east behind us for the last 2 days that's got a mean look about it. There's no saying how long that'll take to clear. Anything about routes, codes to bypass the boundaries, occupants, countermeasures. We have a lot of ground to cover, and maybe not terribly long to do it." "You don't want much, do you?" she muttered, before pausing. "South? How far south?" Rowan turned suspiciously on Kendra, focusing intently, before she started and gasped. "Gods above, Caleb! A human? You're ferrying a human through the garden over the tiers? You've read every account in this place. You know what they are. You're helping one of them? Has your time in the wilds robbed you of what little reason you had?
Maybe, he replied evenly. I suppose that will make it very frustrating for you to try to argue me out of it. He shrugged lightly, but Rowan did not warm to the levity. She pushed herself back from the table, back from Kendra, her eyes distinctly fearful. Adrian tucked an arm around Kendra's waist, uncomprehendingly defensive. She's not like you think, not violent, Rowan, Caleb said, now more seriously. Frankly, she's a much greater danger to herself than she is to anybody else.
I am not a danger to myself, Kendra interjected testily. I think I recall pulling your fat out of the fire, actually.
And you very nearly died doing it, he shot back. She did save me, Rowan, he admitted, turning back to his sister. If I leave her now, she'll never make it out, and I owe her. Rowan groaned.
Oh, she's just perfect for you, isn't she?
She rubbed her eyes before sighing in resignation.
Well, I suppose I have to thank you, Kendra Arbuthnot, as wrong as it feels to thank a human. My brother loves to champion lost causes and sad maidens. It's very decent of you to indulge him, and to keep him out of trouble.
Kendra tactfully did not laugh as Caleb's face flushed. Listen, if you're just here to distract us...
Peace, big brother. I'll help with your research project.
Rowan's look was tender, bright with laughter in the face of Caleb's glower, and for a moment Kendra caught a glimpse of the siblings as they once had been.
Now, let's see just what we have here.
They sat in quiet conversation for some time. Rowan was quick-witted and relentless in the teasing of her brother, but watching her, Kendra could see that the elf remained uneasy. She carefully avoided eye contact, even with a smile on her face, and any of Kendra's movements caused her to tense before forcibly relaxing.
She's afraid, Kendra realized, half-stunned. I'm like a monster out of a storybook to her.
She sat, stewing wearily for some time, not fully listening to the talk over papers and scrolls. It was late now, a few hours still before dawn. Kendra might have drifted off to sleep when she felt Adrian stiffen suddenly beside her. She blinked drowsily. Caleb and Rowan had taken no notice, their heads together over a pile of papers, murmuring.
You all right?
She asked in a whisper. He was sweating, his eyes flickering about the room. His fingers were clawed at his knees, and her stomach dropped. He was drawing blood. She grabbed his hands, but he hardly seemed to notice, fingers clenching and unclenching in some phantom impulse.
Adrian, she said forcefully.
The researchers looked up, scandalized, but she paid them no mind.
What is it?
His mouth opened and closed searchingly, even as a sudden panic thrashed and bucked in his eyes, a cornered animal just barely confined. Finally, he croaked out 2 words. Kendra thought she was the only one to hear him, because at that moment a scream split the night.
It's here.
Caleb was on his feet, bristling, before Kendra could even begin to think. She flinched away from him. His eyes were a blazing red.
Wait!
Rowan began warningly, reaching out for his wrist, but he was already gone with a snarl. He took off, running to start, before dropping to all fours in a loping charge until he had burst from the front entrance, hanging flowers swinging in his wake. Rowan hissed something in a strange language, then glared at Kendra.
Stay here! Keep out of sight!
Then she was after him. Kendra watched her go, hesitant. It weighed on her as she sat in the corner, small, frightened, and useless. But then, if she followed, she might well just make things worse. She pushed those feelings to the side as she turned back to Adrian. He was trembling. "It's all right," she murmured, the lie uncomfortable on her tongue, but she could offer little else. She held him, patting his back impotently, when a tune came unbidden to her lips. It was rough, simple, without much rhythm, and Kendra couldn't remember having ever heard it before, but it was somehow familiar nonetheless. Though it was wordless, it felt like sitting in afternoon sunlight with an old friend. And Adrian stopped shaking. "Come on," she said quietly, giving him a strained smile. "I think we might have to move quickly soon." Noise was growing outside, some commotion and shouting. Together they rose, arm in arm, and crept to the door, peering cautiously out. And in spite of herself, Kendra gasped. The moon was high that night, or she would have been near blind. There had never been any sign of fire in the village all through the night. The treetops were cast in an unreal silver, leaving the scene bizarrely monotone, but for a splash of color at the center of it all. 2 red eyes, startling, bestial. Caleb seemed transformed, and Kendra might have shrank back from him, but for what he was glaring at. A figure stood across from him in the moonlight, a body at his feet, entrails in his hands, a gaping grin under a shock of red hair. It seemed a tableau for a timeless moment of horror, frozen and breathless, as Kendra looked at the thing with Thomas's face. Then Caleb screamed, a wounded animal, and the world shattered into motion again. It was decided before it had ever begun. Caleb's limbs were animated with a fury to match his fiery eyes. He moved like a predator, clawed hands striking in a blur of lethal intent. But Caleb never touched it. He never came close. That thing that was not Thomas moved around Caleb like a column of smoke, swaying with a limp, boneless quality, graceless and dangling, puppet-like. And even in the midst of the heated assault, he smiled and smiled. Finally, Caleb lashed out, and the figure was gone. Kendra watched with her heart in her throat as a shadow slipped out from between the cottages, looming behind Caleb as he staggered. It raised its hand, its fingers pale and narrow and pointed, and she started to move, frantic and hopeless, knowing that she could never, never arrive before the blow fell. A cry rang out as Rowan came flying from across the way. She had Caleb in her arms and went wildly careening away down the lane. The thing cocked its head in some alien consideration and began to take a strange wobbling step toward its quarry when a wave enveloped it. It was as if the ocean of leaves had come rolling up and crashing down, branches and vines lashing and encircling with a life of their own. It undulated and pulsed violently, and Kendra noticed for the first time a small elf, old and frail. Her arms waved with deliberation, as if conducting a tumultuous orchestra, calling up the forest to her aid. The whole mass writhed, snake-like, for some time, until the little elf paused, satisfied, a great and perfect dome of wood and leaves coming to rest with her. She turned unerringly to where Kendra knelt in the shadowy entrance of the library and beckoned to her. "Come here, child. It's over now." Kendra had risen from her hiding place and was walking to meet the old elf before she had realized what she was doing. The words had resonated with an invitation and welcome, such that doubt never crossed her mind. She took the last few steps with some trepidation, coming to an uncertain stop a few paces off. For her part, the old elf never dropped her gentle smile. "You arrived with our prodigal son, I take it?" she asked kindly. Kendra pursed her lips, then nodded. She had a feeling that lying to this woman would have been a futile exercise. The woman nodded with understanding.
Well, he always was an irascible sort. I had assumed he'd be coming back one day, but this was more trouble than even I anticipated.
She held out her hand, emanating ease.
What is your name, little one?
Kendra took it cautiously. Kendra Arberth. And please don't be angry with him, ma'am. I know he's not supposed to be here, but he only came in the first place because he's been trying to help me.
She laughed. Of that I have no doubt. Come, let's go see that our valiant protector hasn't hurt himself too badly. Call me Yara.
Kendra felt warm. Though she had no context for the term, Yara's company felt deeply grandmotherly. They began to walk arm in arm around the dome, Kendra a little nervously.
Oh, you needn't worry about that, Yara said with surprising hardness. I may be old, but not yet will I allow abominations to run amok in my home.
They turned the corner of the dome to find a small crowd surrounding Caleb. He did not appear to be injured, though he was doubtlessly more surly than she'd ever seen him. The crowd parted before Kendra and her escort, and Caleb's eyes flashed.
You were supposed to stay out.
He stopped mid-sentence as his eyes passed over Kendra's companion. Elder Yara, he murmured, subdued if not quite contrite.
Hello, Caleb, Yara said sternly. I see the years haven't improved your courtesies much. Yelling at guests, sneaking around. But the fact that you brought that thing chasing after you so carelessly into our city, that is a much more serious matter. You're lucky the man it attacked will live, or else I might have been forced to be quite hard on you.
It wasn't following us, Caleb grumbled his words into the ground.
Perhaps it attacked here on the same night our wanderer returns home after all these years merely by happenstance, Yara offered with a slight edge. Come now, boy, have a little sense.
I've never seen that thing before tonight, Caleb insisted hotly, to a rumble of disapproval from the crowd. Yara held up her hand to quiet them. Well, actually, Kendra said quietly, I have seen it before. Caleb gaped, stunned, but Yara just nodded grimly for her to continue. It was in my camp the night before I crossed the river. The words came uncomfortably. Everyone was staring, with looks ranging from confusion to outright hostility. But Yara squeezed her hand, and Kendra continued. I was running from it, actually. That's why me and my friend... She winced as Caleb's eyes flared slightly. I jumped into the river. It was killing people. There was nowhere to run. I'm sorry. I had no idea it was chasing me. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt.
Why didn't you tell me about this thing? Caleb asked.
Kendra cringed, but Yara only clicked her tongue impatiently.
Did you ask, Caleb?
He ground his teeth, but fell silent.
Well, Kendra, running was very wise of you. There was nothing you could have done to fight that thing. You and your friend, well, you are only alive today because of what you did.
Yara patted her shoulder with a bony hand, but Kendra could take little comfort in it. I think I lost a lot more friends than I saved that night, she said smallly. Faces flashed in her mind. Boris and Moira, and then Thomas's. She couldn't remember him as he was then, smiling and cheerful, face lively and warm. It was twisted now, a tapestry stretched to tearing.
It's wearing the face of one of my old friends from the caravan. My friend Thomas. What did you say?
Yara's voice snapped with an abrupt urgency.
Start over, girl. Tell me everything.
Behind them, there was a great rending, wood and branches and something else, and Yara's grip on Kendra's shoulder went suddenly tense and then slack. From Yara's chest, a spray of gore burst forth, splattering wetly. Kendra could feel it hot on her face. The hand, dripping blood, pulled unceremoniously out of the old woman, body falling carelessly to the side. Kendra let out a squeak and dropped beside her, mind blank with shock. She placed hands over the gaping hole, but there was so much blood staining her hands in crimson gouts. "I missed you, Kendra," came a voice, and she flinched because she knew that voice. It was so familiar, boyish and young. It was Thomas, and it was not Thomas. Disbelief momentarily overwhelming her mindless horror, she turned her gaze behind. Almost immediately, she shut her eyes. Running never occurred to her. How does one outrun death? Kendra only curled herself protectively over the bleeding elf. At the nape of her neck she felt a hot breath rolling over saw-like teeth and a grin that pulled too wide, much too wide. There was a screech and a moment of sudden wind. The thing that wore Thomas's face was hissing behind her, and the hand left her neck. But before she could turn, there was a deafening roar like a gale, and a great force toppled her onto her face. Twigs and leaves buffeted her on all sides as she clung desperately to the ground. Then, as quickly as it came, it died. Kendra lay for several long moments before she got to her knees, shaking, and turned once more. Adrian stood over a yawning hole in the canopy where the thing had been, framed in silver moonlight. He cut a figure, regal, solemn, and profoundly lonely, a prince over his father's grave. There seemed almost a keyhole upon his breast, as if the moon peered through slim bars between his ribs. Then the clouds passed over the moon, and swaying, he began to fall. Kendra ran to him as he slumped towards the pit. In that moment, the gap was nothing to her. She only knew that no one else could be hurt tonight while she stood by. With a strangled cry, she vaulted over the gap with a gut-wrenching leap before sliding under his falling body with a graceless thud. He was sweating heavily, barely conscious, and she cradled him with bloody hands. A small crowd was moving purposefully around where Elder Yara had fallen, and guilt stabbed at her for what she had brought upon these people. But Kendra went unnoticed. All the action was directed around the fallen elder, many kneeling near her, speaking intently and quietly as basins and bundles were brought to the healers. Still alive, she thought, relief allowing her a rattling breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. Not quite all attention was drawn to Yara. Caleb and Rowan picked their way past the crowd to meet Kendra, walking carefully around the hole. It was wider than she had first realized, the height of 2 grown men across. She felt a little dizzy to contemplate having traversed it on such unawares. Her mind had been entirely with Adrian. "Well, this explains a few things," muttered Caleb darkly. He was not looking at Kendra, staring now firmly down at Adrian. "How long have you been traveling with him?" Rowan asked, tone dazed and disbelieving. "You should have known." "How would I have known? You know they can go unnoticed when they want to." "That doesn't explain—"
Kendra waved a hand sharply, holding a finger to her mouth and gesturing to Adrian's sleeping form. "What," she asked quietly, "are you two talking about?" Rowan knelt beside the two of them, keeping a wary distance. "Look at his chest, Kendra." There, still shimmering as if with trapped moonlight, was a small mark. It showed a tall column, flat beneath his collarbone, wrapped in the vines of a rose. Kendra blinked uncomprehendingly. "This wasn't here before. What does it mean? Why does he have this mark?" Rowan gestured across the courtyard to a small statue that sat in a dark corner next to a fountain, small and simple. Two hooded women linked hands into a circle. They had stood on a small column, some of the only stone Kendra had seen in the treetop village, wrapped in thorny rose vines. "It's their mark," Rowan explained quietly. "The mark of the sisters. The column and the rose as one, the masonry and the wilds. They only place that mark on what is theirs, their own creations, and their familiars." Kendra gaped, dumbfounded. "Adrian is a—" She could not finish. "How is that even possible?" she asked, feeling unexpectedly angry. "No one can own Adrian. He's not theirs, no matter who they are or how many statues they have. He's a person, damn it!" "He's not, in point of fact," Caleb said gruffly. "I've heard that they have all manner of abilities, and it doesn't surprise me that the ability to change form is one of them. But regardless, it's undeniable. He is the familiar of one of the witch sisters. At a guess from the display back there, I'd say Genevieve, sister of stones, which would make him, in point of fact, a raven." "He's not wrong," Rowan agreed quietly. "That mark makes it certain. The familiars are bound to the witches, and the witches to the familiars, but usually they're left to their own devices and fancies. They're keepers and watchers, of a sort. Guardians. Clearly, the familiar—" "Adrian," Kendra cut in insistently. Caleb snorted, but Rowan quelled him and nodded. "Clearly, Adrian here has taken an uncommon interest in you. Something very odd seems to be happening. There's a great many things I don't understand. That he's been so long in a human form and taken such an interest in you, well, both strike me as very strange." "You're attracting rather a lot of attention," Caleb said, nodding. "That thing that's been chasing you, whatever it is, has rather an unhealthy fixation as well, so it would seem. You said you met it before. It must have been following you for at least 2 days and nights, then." Kendra shook her head, overwhelmed, a chill dread hanging about her shoulders. "It started following me the night I met Adrian," she objected. "If he's so important, that monster is probably following him, right?" "It spoke to you, Kendra," Rowan said gently. "It went right by Adrian. It even knew your name." Kendra swallowed. "But I'm nobody," she said smallly. Caleb laughed uncouthly, and Rowan swatted him with disapproval, but the smile he suddenly wore was almost comforting. "Maybe you were nobody out there, Kendra Aberth, but you seem to have landed yourself in some hot water. So, congratulations are in order. You're certainly somebody now." Across the pit, Elder Yara had been lifted onto a stretcher and was being ushered away into the cold pre-dawn dark. There was a low rumbling as the clouds continued to pass in, thunderous and almost discontent. Most of the crowd stood near the hole, murmuring quietly over the destruction.
Still, a few more seemed to be turning their attention to the small huddle across the gap. "That's our cue to leave," Caleb muttered.
"You're leaving already? Again?" asked Rowan, suddenly distraught. "What about the maps you came here for?"
Caleb tensed, his jaw set, but Kendra coughed quietly.
"Actually," she said cautiously, "I think I found something."
Slowly, she pulled the strange book from her satchel.
"What?"
cried the siblings, near identical looks of incredulity and outrage on their faces. She almost could have laughed. Caleb reached out to grab the book, but Rowan was faster, reading with eyes flicking in a near blur.
"What is this? I've never seen it before."
Rowan's eyes snapped up to Kendra.
"And when did you stow this away?"
"Oh," Kendra mumbled guiltily.
When you showed up and I thought we were being caught, I just, tucked it away for safekeeping."
Rowan's look of outrage intensified, but Caleb was reading over her shoulder, and a wolfish grin was spreading across his face.
"Not bad, Miss Arbeth, not bad," he said with unmistakably wild delight.
His eyes flickered back across the way where clear muttering and pointing had begun. He cleared his throat. "Well then, it's time we be off."
"Hold on," Rowan interjected hotly. "Things have changed. You have one of the witch's familiars with you, in a—"
She lowered her voice, glancing down at Adrian nervously.
"in a strange condition. Kendra, I know you want to be able to get home, but this is important. Something is clearly wrong."
"I gave my word she'd get home," Caleb said baldly. "Nothing is going to interfere with that, especially not you." Rowan's fists clenched, but Kendra held up a reassuring hand.
"We'll look after Adrian. I won't let anything happen to him."
Kendra squeezed him gently, protectively.
"We need to stay ahead of that thing anyway, and that was going all right, well, before tonight."
Rowan crossed her arms.
"You need to stay ahead of that thing, Kendra. It's following you, and from the sound of it, Adrian's been saving you, and not without a cost. Look at him. Great feats of magic aren't free. There's always a price to pay, always. Are you really going to keep putting him in harm's way like this?"
Caleb snarled.
"He's the witch's raven, Rowan. He can take care of himself." "He's sick. Something's clearly wrong."
"Oh, now you care about the troubles of others."
"I'm not about to let you—" "Stop!"
Kendra's reprimand carried sharply and with unexpected command. To her surprise, the siblings fell silent. She closed her eyes for a moment, thinking hard. In that moment, his small frame in her arms had a weight that felt like destiny. Then she sighed.
"You're right, Rowan. It's wrong of me to put my troubles on him. Can he stay here?"
She nodded, eyes filling with something like respect, or maybe it was just pity.
"The familiar, Adrian, can stay with us for as long as he chooses, and we'll have all our resources at his disposal. Anything he needs will be provided for him."
Kendra looked down at him, at his fitful, pale face. Even in exhausted oblivion, he curled towards her, not quite clinging. She cleared her throat, gently laid his head down off her lap, and stood.
"Tell him," she began, but what was there to say? "Tell him I'm sorry I had to leave without, saying goodbye. Tell him thank you for everything, for saving me and being... have some dignity."
She bowed to Rowan.
"Thank you as well."
They began to walk quickly away from the crowd, to the periphery of the living city. They came out of the clouds within a few minutes, stepping back into moonlight.
It felt incongruously peaceful after the violence only minutes before. It was still several hours before dawn, and the air was calm. Soon they came to a drop, and to a long, pliant branch. "If you go quickly, you'll keep ahead of the storm and that thing," Rowan said, voice a little fragile. She reached out and took Kendra's hands. "I wish you the best of luck, Kendra Abath. I hope you make it home, and we will take care of him." Kendra swallowed, but could find no words. She nodded. Rowan turned to her brother, and for several moments they sized each other up. Then she embraced him. He stood rigidly in her arms, but Kendra could see his eyes cool, the fires smoldering into coals. "I lost you long ago. You'd think I'd be used to it now," she murmured throatily. "I almost wish—" She murmured something in her language, and Caleb laughed sadly. "I don't regret my choices, little sister, but I wouldn't want that for you. You're where you ought to be." He relaxed a little into her and patted the top of her head. "I am sorry to be such a poor example to you," he said, and despite his smile, his voice shook for just a moment. "I'm afraid I'm not an especially good older brother." Rowan snorted and stepped back, looking between the two of them. "You will be what you are," she said fondly. Then she turned and slipped back between the corridors of leaves. They stood for a few moments, looking back. The clouds were still rolling in after them, slowly subsuming the city on the chill early morning wind. The silent giants advanced, silver-coated and ominous. "We've got to go," she said, feeling strangely muted. At last, Caleb sighed. He began to push down the long, naked branch, worn smooth until he was kneeling, pushing it nearly flat. "Careful," he warned. He took her by the hand, and then, cat-like, he stepped down onto the branch and began to walk down it. It bent under them as they went, sliding them slowly downwards, and it was like the world was moving beneath her feet. But Caleb held her steady. They made their way slowly down to another such platform, with another long, flexible branch, the previous one springing back up into the night. So it was that they made their patient descent once more down into the garden. "These aren't a very practical way of getting up and down," Kendra remarked some time later, breaking the brooding silence. "They seem pretty dangerous. I don't know why you don't just have a staircase." Her voice came whining in her own ears, but she just wanted to talk. Her thoughts were too heavy to be turned over endlessly in her head. Caleb raised an eyebrow, undeceived. "Your judgment is based on two false assumptions," he said, eventually, humoring her. "Firstly, they're only impractical if you're you, when in fact they were never meant for you. They were meant for my people, with a certain basic threshold of dexterity being expected to its users." He smirked back at her as her eyes rolled with exasperation. "Secondly," he continued, "they're designed to be hard to ascend without invitation. Elves don't generally want visitors, and they themselves go down only very rarely. If they need to return, then someone drops the branches down to them. It's quite secure." He looked back again, and his eyes were now serious and scarcely colored in the pale moonlight. "So there's no sense in worrying about him anymore. He's well out of reach now of most anything, even us." Kendra scowled. "I didn't say anything about Adrian." "You really didn't have to." Her throat was tight, her jaw set, but her words were steady. "I did the right thing." "I suppose that's why you're in such good spirits." "What would you have me do then, Caleb?" She wanted to snap at him, She wanted to scream, anything to relieve that pressure in her chest, but her voice was muted, dull. She was tired. The night was drawing long now. Dawn couldn't be far off. "Well, Kendra," he said with a note of impatience, "I wouldn't mind if you took care of yourself, just for once. I believe that's the only thing I've ever asked of you." "I can't keep putting Adrian in danger," she said with finality. "I know he's gotten us out of a few tough spots, and maybe we'd be safer if he were with us, but I can't be that selfish. He's a witch's familiar. This is his world, where he belongs. I can't drag him into my problems anymore." Caleb sighed. "Don't insult me. I didn't say you should bring him to make you safer, like he's a weapon to gird yourself with. I'll protect you. I asked you to take care of yourself." He shook his head, exasperated. "And as for dragging him, I never saw him complaining. He looked quite happy to be by your side, as happy as you were to be with him." Her thoughts flickered back to the past few days, traveling with Adrian. His eyes were quick and sharp, but they still held a soft dependence, a naked affection that had made her perilous time in the garden almost comforting. And stronger still now, she felt a disgust. "I'm not selfish enough to drag him through danger just so I can play the beloved nurse," she said with a clear and quiet fury. "Do I wish he were with us? Sure, but what of it? In the end, he's better off without me." "He might be better off up there in the city," Caleb said eventually. "They'll take good care of him, and he'll be safe until he's ready to get on where he's going. The familiars have been going about their business for as long as there's been sisters in the garden. He'll be fine. So, what about you?" Kendra stared forward into the darkness as they went, gathering herself. "Don't worry about me," she said finally, her voice mild and assuaging. "I'll be fine." They had reached the ground again, the last branch swinging resolutely back up to the living city, now shrouded in cloud. Caleb looked back to her with raised eyebrows, considering her critically, before he snorted. "As you like it," he said. "But now you're going to get on my back." He kneeled away from her expectantly. Kendra blinked at the sudden change in tack. "What?" she squawked. "Why?" "Because we need to put distance between ourselves and that thing, and because you're nearly dead on your feet. You've had a long day, and you're only human, so stop playing the hero and let me carry you a while." The proposal made her feel more than a little like a child, but her head was half spinning now after their descent, her eyelids drooping. She shrugged and stepped into his waiting arms. "Thanks," she said somewhat reticently. He nodded, amused, then took off. It should not have surprised her, but she seemed to be almost no burden at all to Caleb. He took off at a light jog through the undergrowth, but his movements were smooth and graceful, such that it hardly shook her from her perch. She was only barely hanging on, and the scenery passed in a dark and shifting blur around her, a ship with fair wind riding a calm night sea. In short order, she was being rocked into a drowsy stupor. "He was a bird all along," she mumbled blearily some time later. He chuckled, vibrating against her through his lean, powerful frame. "A raven, I'm fairly sure." She blinked muzzily. "How do you figure?" "Well, the familiars are two brothers of sorts. Two brothers for the two sisters. They're figures of legend in their own right, and Adrian fits the profile of the raven of Lady Genevieve. Friendly and playful at times, but a master of the winds. He's got a bit of a reputation as a trickster, too." Kendra smiled in spite of herself, and might have dozed off,
but something tugged at the back of her mind. After a while, she asked, "What about the other one?" "The other familiar? I don't think that's Adrian. He's a bit more of a serious figure. That would be the hunted king, Lady Arlene's familiar, the witch's hare." Kendra did not sleep for a long time.